artifact. But what most people don't know is that it was actually the essence of the ancient Egyptian empire that allowed for power and wealth to accumulate in monarchy through a tax exemption that was embedded in the Rosetta Stone. It basically said that the military, the priests, and so forth would not be taxed. All power would accrue to the monarchy. And because the uber wealthy were not taxed, she fell to the poor, whose bodies were used, and when they were about to drop dead once a year, the priests, like philanthropists in the modern era, would give them a little bit of charity to keep them going. Now, the structure of the ancient Egyptian empire was embedded in a secret language that the accountants and lawyers of today have mastered. And these people were known as the scribes. So the scribes of today, which that is largely inaccessible to normal people. And that's why it's very, very important not to have a respect for power or for people who are uselessly important, dressed in suits, living the air-conditioned life where it doesn't matter. Uselessly important, dressed in suits, living the air-conditioned life where it doesn't matter. Power must be earned, respect must be earned. So let's take away the language of the scribes and think about what really matters to normal people and speak in that language. So when we think about South Africa's economy today, we tend to think of it as Fabio, the strong, blonde, absurdly vain man who cries if you insult him. So it's extremely fragile. Santon is extremely fragile. It's very predatory. You buy a 60 Rand cappuccino, that's fucking absurd. Absolutely. Let's just be honest. And so that's how the economy is framed. White monopoly capital is dead sea dominant. There's white fragility all around. Please don't talk about us. My best friend is black and so forth. But at the heart of it, that's not really our economy. Our economy is the next one. It's the white economy that has predated itself so much by looting its own capital. So as money is leaving the mining sector appears to be less profitable than it is, because illicit financial activities and flows is actually anti-competitive. Companies that play by the rules are penalized, whereas companies that don't manage to shift their wealth offshore. So our economy is actually where over 60% of people earn less than 900 Rand a month. It is welfare dependent, it's harmful, it's bleeding cash, and it's literally addicted to some very, very bad habits that the addict limit. And that's pretty crucial, making sure that we don't think of our economy as Fabio, but as the crippled 24-year-old meth head that tries to get out of taking responsibility as much as possible. So just some simple facts we can talk about. We went from being an apartheid society, the most unjust society in the world, to the most unequal according to the World Bank. That's using the Gini coefficient, but the Gini coefficient doesn't take into account the data bias at the top, which is that the wealth of the wealthy cannot be measured because they relocate their power and profit from here to elsewhere, where legal and financial secrecy that is sovereign-backed gives them protection. But the World Bank says even though they cannot truly measure the wealth that is being taken or siphoned or hidden, South Africa is now the most unequal country in the world. That's a pretty shit thing to be number one for. 1% of our country has 50% of the wealth, and less than 50% own less than 5% of asset wealth and income. Of course, 9 out of 10 poor people are black, but what the poverty metrics don't tell you is that the poorest group are 17 or under, and the second poorest group are the young adult group. So we've condemned a future generation to dispossession in an economy that is literally a young adult and that no longer has any reason to cry about apartheid policies because we've had the chance to address it correctively and with remedial powers. So as citizens, we also need to take responsibility for how we've allowed our political economy to develop. So we're just going to quickly go into the banksters. Banks are one of, as Mr. Henry mentioned, banks are one of the biggest facilitators of illicit financial flows. And right now, we're kind of caught on where the Tax Justice Network was 10 years ago, which is under invoicing of commodities. We're not really looking at the other issues he mentioned, which is flow to stock, how money moves, why it moves, where it moves. The EU's 20th largest banks are led by HSBC, and I'm mentioning it because we're going to go into a Gupta case study. 7% of employees across these secrecy jurisdictions capture 30% of the global bank profit. So while we expect banks and accounting firms to regulate the so-called red flags of the economy, they are using precisely the same systems to profit shift their own money. And part of the profit shifting of their own money is money from kleptocrats, which kleptocrats, the Sani Abachas and the Guptas, cannot claim back because now it's been flagged as illegal money. But it also is not being recovered because it's in tax havens. And how does the government get access to information in order to recover the assets? So a lot of the times banks get to keep the money that has been stolen from other countries, and that is part of their liquidity. HSBC, for example, has 20% of unexplained activity. The money flows through 5 intermediary islands. And the reason I'm mentioning islands is because these small island economies are largely under the umbrella of countries like the US and the UK that determine and diagnose what corruption is. But if the UK is developing systems like EITI and anti-corruption platforms, but they put the secrecy jurisdictions as some of the cleanest countries in the world, and the African countries on the corruption perception index as some of the dirtiest countries. So we are only taught to think of the so-called hooker or sex worker as the criminal, but the person who's supplying the service, the facilitator, the pull and push mechanism, or what economists call supply and demand, is not being contextualized. So we forget who are the so-called cleanest countries in the world, the Mauritius, the Netherlands, the Switzerland, the US, the UK, that control how legal and financial secrecy is implemented globally. And that is where and why their interest in diagnosing corruption comes in. If we leave it to public interest for private interest, we're only looking at the users. We're not looking at the people that provide the service. And once the profits go from the intermediary islands that are really small, really poor, and don't have much power, the UK still controls the privy councils of these small island states. We then see that the profit actually flows out to jurisdictions where it's booked, Luxembourg, Hong Kong, Singapore Island, before it's repatriated back into the US or UK in ways that don't trigger taxation. So the money is ending up in real big economies, and it's using tax havens as a veil to make us lose the paper trail. That's the only reason why really poor island economies, caught between coconuts and criminality, where there's a small class of elite in existence, are receiving this money. So is the British Virgin Islands your enemy, or is it part of the problem? Who is the actual corruptor in the process? So this is an example of the 72,000 flag HSBC transactions that laundered some of the Gupta's money out of South Africa. And this is important to show because the trail shows you how the money left Transnet and Eskom into shell companies controlled by the Guptas before being dispersed to over 160 shell companies, where the money then ended up in the US and the UK, so the Guptas could use Spotify and Uber and the House of Curries and whatever they wanted to do. You see those transactions for $100. You see payments from this account to the Rolls Royce, but you actually see how the whole system is diagnosed so that you lose the trail. And HSBC did this because it's higher transaction fees on risky stuff. It's liquidity for their company, and they'll probably get to keep a lot of the money that can't be recovered. This is 1/100th of the Gupta's corporate structures. Sure. And it basically is designed to show how, not just through state contracts, but how loans, insider trading, all of these monies were collected and redistributed. They would take a loan out from the bank, use money from the state to repay the loan. So they made the money from the bank loan. Then they refunneled money, repurposed money coming from the state back into these companies, and in so doing were able to repay banks. Anyway, a lot of boring stuff, but it's 1/100th of the system. And that's what hopefully our government is trying to unravel. This is, for example, a way of how they move money through intercompany loans. So one parent company will shuffle money between different subsidiaries of the same company, and in the process, through loans that never actually existed, through fictitious loans, but actual public lending that leads to public debt is one of the ways that they did it. Thank you. So in this HSBC state capture case, we looked at 72,000 transactions, 108 shell companies, a dozen tax havens. The key banks that were involved were Standard Chartered, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, HSBC. We were able to track about $321 million in kickbacks, but the money in kickbacks was less important than understanding the formula that they used to take the money out, because whether or not the Gupta steal, that makes no difference. How do the banks facilitate a system that allows for anyone to come in and make use of it? Because if we don't close those escape routes and vulnerabilities now, this is going to keep happening again and again, as we'll show. So just speaking about IFFs, which is one part of the problem, it relates to the 1% who easily escape taxation. It artificially depreciates the profitability of industry, of labor unions who can then say, listen, your revenue's up, we want a higher wage, of sectoral competitiveness. The Gini coefficient is blind in one eye and seeing in the other. So while it's important to use, we need to understand that they are working with a data bias. It manipulates the discourse. So a person with a house that is visible, or the middle class who earn money, are now paying a double tax. They're paying private security, private hospitals, private schools, and so forth. It's an economy that's built on the middle class that is rapidly being crushed, while the uber rich companies and persons get away with it, and the poor are taxed very intensively through that. So we know in South Africa there's a 50 billion rand VAT increase, tax increase from South Africa. So the poor are going to subsidize the theft. But is the Ramaphosa government going to make sure that asset recovery of that 50 billion comes back? That's important, not how you plug the leak, but who actually pays for the leak that took place. So when we talk about terms and diagnosis, we find that NGOs can be part of the problem because they use words like poverty and corruption that are very generic or that can mean anything and everything. What are the words that actually diagnose the problem? And are we legitimizing incorrect diagnosis that lead to incorrect solutions that don't actually help the man on the street? Let's skip this one. So we'll be talking about under-invoicing, often through trade-related fraud, but there's a lot of stuff that we haven't really gone into. Public lending, state debt, public borrowing. And this, for example, is what the Bank of Baroda did, not just in South Africa, but in India. By giving out loans that default, the Indian public, as a state-owned bank, have to subsidize those loans. So it happens all over the world with state-owned banks. When we're thinking about systems that must nationalize, we have to think about the fact that we may be turning everything over to governments that really don't have responsiveness to citizens. So I'll shut up soon. Thank you. Let's skip everything. Skip it all. The next one. So this is basically insider trading. The Gupta managed to make over 1.2 billion by manipulating the interest rate from floating to fixed. So how do these things come up in a commission when there's no contract in place? There's no invoice that's issued. Because the amount of money that's been stolen with the collusion of Nedbank, the only bank that would take up this shit, not only hosting the Bank of Baroda's account, but in allowing manipulation of insider trading to take place, which is then given in the basis points. 0.21 shifts to 0.89. The difference in basis points is how they made 250 million rand per fall, while disempowering Transnet's own treasury unit. Let's move on. So anyway, when it comes down to it, we have very many ways that money is being stolen, not just through trade or minerals. It's market dominance, insider trading, public lending, public borrowing. Let's move on. This is the Angolan government. While we're mapping how the Angolan regime, the Dos Santos regime operated, like SWAPO, like the ANC, like the BDP, we get to see the dominant political parties that were liberation movements. When they came into power, they began to function like corporations, taking a cut of shares for big companies that were to get big deals. So you see that this is 1/1000th of how diamond money was stolen from Angola. These diamonds end up on the necks of celebrities that Nicole Kidman, Kim Kardashian, because Isabel Dos Santos had a partnership with Foz Rossi, who of course got the best Angolan diamonds. And as we know, diamonds are an exceptional mineral. The value of the diamond depends on what the company says it is. And even in South Africa, which we'll go into very shortly, De Beers managed to under-invoice 40 billion rand in a period of 7 years by donating their staff to the state diamond trader to value the diamonds that they were given exemption on. So this is an example of how media can sometimes get things wrong. When Sudan lost the black gold from South Sudan, suddenly the Bashir government needed to find a way to generate revenue. We hear about the Darfur massacres, the Arabs versus the Africans, but what most people don't know is that in Sudan, there's a mine, a gold mine, the third largest in Africa, called Jebel Amir. And the Janjaweed were used as the force to manage all of these laborers who were either killed or coerced. And that gold would eventually be purchased by so-called conflict-free companies like Apple, Intel, because the gold would go through secrecy jurisdictions which host over 80% of the world's biggest refineries. So Dodd-Frank looks at the origin of gold, but it does not look at the role of refineries based in tax havens where gold loses its actual origin, and then Dubai becomes the provenance. So we could see from Sudan, the Sudan Financial Services Arm, which is sanctioned by the US OFAC, was exported to Dubai, to Kaloti, and Kaloti would export to Valcambi, a big Swiss refiner that's one of the world's top 4 clean refineries. And from Switzerland, Valcambi, Apple, and Intel, and really big companies would buy it. So it wasn't really the Arabs killing the Africans just for fun or for discrimination. It was because Darfur had one of the biggest gold mines in Africa. Sudan is now the world's, the continent's third largest gold producer, and the gold eventually ended up in a country that sanctioned this specific problem. So secrecy jurisdictions not only siphon money, but it also siphons sovereign power of countries to sanctions, of countries to regulate their resources, of citizens to fight back. This was just a very quick example on where the Kimberley process is so fucking shit. It basically says 99% of diamonds are conflict-free, but again, in 2003, Dubai had a $5 million diamond industry. They didn't cut or produce any diamonds. Once the Kimberley process comes in, you see that Dubai now has the right to issue a mixed origin certificate. Suddenly, over 70% of African diamonds are flowing through Dubai. In Angola and the DRC, it was over 110 million every month. Under invoiced by half, it would go through Dubai, the real invoicing would be put in place, and Dubai would be the country of export. The money that financed the Angolan regime's diamond exploitation and the Angolans controlling the DRC diamonds came from an arms dealer called Arcadi Denmark, who used the British Virgin Islands Bank that he part owned. So sometimes the criminals can create their own banks in tax havens. For example, in Luxembourg, it takes $7 million to create your own bank. In Mauritius, $5 million. That's where Alvaro Sobrino from the Angolan Dos Santos regime tried to set up his banking investment companies there. So sometimes the shareholders of the bank can be the money launderers. Just quickly moving on. Mr. Henry mentioned the case of Filomeno Dos Santos and the Sovereign Wealth Fund earlier. This is one of the examples. Over a period of 5 days, $100 million remitted from the Sovereign Wealth Fund to Kijinga, shell companies, and then to Banco Kwanza, where the Swiss guy, Jean-Claude Bastos, was the shareholder of the bank alongside the president's son. So the logistics of control, who owns the bank, who owns the shell companies, which jurisdictions are used, is really critical. So this is the process through which De Beers under-invoiced 40 billion. Basically, in South Africa, as in all African countries, the value of a diamond is determined by the diamond company. In court, De Beers said that the government only gets to audit by volume, not by value. The price book is confidential. So they basically would extract a diamond for $140 per carat, 150, frame it as a $70 per carat diamond, and then export it to themselves. By 2010, South Africa was the only country on the African continent, to not have any royalties rates imposed. So diamonds were literally taken for free before. And when the royalties rate came in, by donating their own stuff to the state diamond trader, they were able to give everyone the FBO. Let's skip the next one. So this very quickly is Nigeria's offshore oil regime. Most of the oil rigs were registered in tax havens, which do not regulate for environment, labor, oil royalties. And when a rig that extracts oil from the offshore is relocated elsewhere, the government in question, whether the US in the Gulf of Mexico disaster, where Transocean put their rigs in the Marshall Islands, which the US could not see to regulate, or in Nigeria, basically means when a crisis happens, people die, major oil spill, the rig isn't even within the regulatory regime of Nigeria. So you have to ask Liberia or the Marshall Islands or Panama or Vanuatu, please can you help us? Why would they? They're a tax haven. So different tax havens serve different purposes. And maritime tax havens are the places where cruise ships and oil rigs and really large cargo vessels that launder drugs and humans and timber are actually registered, because you can't tell who owns them or what the purpose is if you can't actually see it. Very quickly, this is using publicly accessible data. We were able to show because in Cameroon we couldn't actually access information. Cameroonian government has an allergy to collecting information. So we just looked at the magazine covers advertising when Cameroon's president actually visited his country. He literally lived in Switzerland most of the time. So whenever he visited his country as a president and he signed off these parliamentary things, literally on the tarmac, we were able to capture it by the covers. And we were able to calculate how much the cost of his foreign travels were, 40,000 euros at the Intercontinental in Switzerland per night for him and his entourage. What a wonderful way to spend the budget. The source of funding, of course, was off budget. All the money that Cameroon should be accessing, which is closed off them. Let's move on. So we were able to see 117 million euros spent on private trips, Intercontinental, 40,000 euros per night for him and his bitches, him and his people. Sorry, my language. Each trip was 855,000 euros, and he signed most of his decrees in the airport before the plane turned around and took him off. A dozen decrees were signed in 3 days in 2017. And so it's a rubber stamping government. This is all publicly accessible information. Let's move on. So as journalists, researchers, these are the questions we tell you to ask the company rather than just focusing on a narrow silo of inquiry. What is the purpose of the company? Where does it operate? what are the names of linked companies, what types of assets, and so forth. So I'll circulate this so I don't steal too much time. But basically, this decodes the language of the scribes because they want. It doesn't mean anything. That will just leave you lost. Like when someone wants to divorce you, they say, "Oh, it's not me, it's you." You're like, "What is the point?" So this is the slide that says, "What is the point?" Tell us the point. Basically, all of the research that we do largely depends on publicly accessible information or information that you can dig up from data registries, court registries. When we were looking at illegal timber trafficking and mining, we use satellite imaging. You can actually go down to the level of the truck and the license plate number of the truck that's moving goods out. This is the import. You can go down a bit. This is the import-export registry. Here you can see the ministry in Angola is importing stuff from Russia's Rocket and Space Corporation, but it's a laminated chair with a plastic backing. So they can put bullshit on their customs manifest, right? They can say, I'm importing spoons, which Angola has imported from Russia's arms company. But at the end of the day, you see who's sending, who's receiving, on what date they're receiving, and what are the details. The next one is just one of the ways that we broke the $4 billion Angola story is just by combing through court records. We can move on. This is just looking for assets. For example, this was Obiang's cruise ship. Where was it registered? Cayman Islands. And the way to find out who really owns the assets or the companies is just to figure out who's paying the $500 fee every year. Because to keep the company alive, someone's got to pay a little bit every year. That's how you start narrowing it down. Let's move on. Okay, so very quickly, all of this research has been funded by OSF. We thank you very much. Just very quickly, I wanted to talk about the BEE model because someone mentioned that Cyril Ramaphosa was not going to change the system, and of course he can't. He can't change the system very much because one of the ways that the South African economy has become the most unequal in the world is through the current legislation that benefits the guys who make their billions from black economic empowerment. Over 70% of the black economic empowerment deals we went through were strategic vendor deals. A company gives a guy money because he's politically connected. He pays that loan back through dividends while making a nice profit. The average man on the street has benefited just 3% from all major mining deals in South Africa. So while Botswana and Namibia take a 10% royalty rate of the minerals from the ground through companies like Anglo American, the same companies that are in South Africa, we take a 2% royalty rate on a sliding scale. Why has our legislation not made sure that our interests are protected? Because of the political umbrellas that make sure that companies are protected and that the right legislation does not come about. That's a really important thing. There's the corrupt looting by the Zuma group, the cash in a suitcase, the stealing of money. But then there's another kind of stealing that happens, and it's technically legal, and it's covered in the language of scribes. So we're not saying it's the president, but we're saying it's the system that helped make the president who he is today. So just the top 5 mining deals, 50.4 billion rand compared to 261 million in SARS schemes from the period that we assessed. Let's move on. Oh, I'm wrapping up. God damn, I'm taking long. So what we are saying, literally, is that in order for South Africa's economy to change, we need to put a tax on illicit financial flows. Look at the South African Reserve Bank in foreign liabilities. Last year, we lost something like 8% to Luxembourg, 7% to Mauritius. These are jurisdictions where no real economic activity occurs. Putting a tax on the 400 billion rand on average that leaves our economy illicitly could generate 100 billion rand, which then could be put into something like a sovereign wealth fund, raising our royalty rates to 10%, making sure that our system is solid through country-by-country reporting, a beneficial ownership registry, a minerals exchange, publication of mining contracts. All of this would ensure that we save R500 billion every year. So we are not a poor country. We are a citizenry that has been pacified by talk that sounds good, but that doesn't really do anything for us or doesn't really have the meaning that we need. So like the Dorian Gray book or the Wizard of Oz, where he says, Dorothy, do not pull back the curtain. We need to be a little bit bolder and a little bit less respectful of power, whoever's in power, and demand our rights as citizens, because the money is there, but people are dying because they don't have transport to get to free medicine. Or if they go to a hospital and they've lost 4 fingers, they got to pick which finger they want to have stitched back. And that is just not acceptable in a very rich country with a great citizenry and a great infrastructure. And best of all, as Mandela would say, lots of coffee chairs. I'm done. I'll stop.
Oh.
Yeah. terrible when I'm on radio. It's like, leave.
I think we can forgive you for all the available information you're providing to the rest of us. At least I do. How many bricks?
We go to slide number 2. Yeah. Amandla.
Awethu.
Amandla.
Awethu.
Amandla.
Awethu.
I think slogans work a lot after lunch. They help us deal with the condition that you described. Yeah. So this is going to be shorter, I guess, because quite a lot has already been discussed since morning, and just now from the incredible presentation by Khadija. I was asked to speak on the case of Glencore in Zambia. Can I invite you to move to, I think, the second, next year, and see if we're able to play just maybe 2 minutes of that video there. It's actually there, that's a video. That thing doesn't. Oh, okay. So that's a technology misfiring. It's okay. Let's for new ones, just go back. Yeah, not the third one. Next one. Yeah, so you can go back there. But the video that I was going to play, I would recommend comrades to look it up. It's a video called "Stealing Africa," and in it you see the contrast between the community in Switzerland, where Glencore CEOs are headquartered, and the community in Zambia, where they're extracting most of their wealth. In fact, the video starts by showing the mayor of that community saying that they had received a call from the bank to say you need to have an account that can receive 360 million Swiss francs. And this is because Glencore had made so much money, and as they were going to be contributing that 360 million as part of the tax to that particular very local community. And there's a whole conversation that happens there, including people saying, look, let's reduce the tax rates of people in our community because we've got this windfall, and others saying, can we at least send 1 million back to the community in Zambia where this wealth is coming from, which ultimately was also defeated as a proposition. But the contrast between the two communities, just how normal and the Swiss community looks, and just how rugged and painstakingly brutal the community in Zambia, where the wealth is coming from. The contrast, tells it tells the whole story. And I think the other thing that I wanted to speak to is that this issue of illicit financial flows that we are discussing right now, it's actually a strange animal. Even I am still getting the grips of it. What makes it very strange for me is that it has given us a very weird consensus. There's actually no one who is not talking about illicit financial flows. From the UN bureaucrats, from our own governments. If you give Cyril Ramaphosa a platform at the UN, he's going to mention illicit financial flows. Mugabe was mentioning illicit financial flows. Buhari in Nigeria, just now from the previous 3 UN summits, he's standing up and talking about illicit financial flows. And you move from there, you go to your multinational corporations themselves. They're also talking about illicit financial flows. The IMF, the World Bank, is talking about illicit financial flows and the need to curtail this. Civil society is talking about illicit financial flows. Trade unions, revolutionary organizations are talking about illicit financial flows. So it becomes really, really strange to say there appears to be this consensus that there's a problem called illicit financial flows and we need to be tackling it. But our language, if you've been sitting in conversations on illicit financial flows for the last maybe 7 years now, it's actually pretty much the same things that we're talking about. And the statistics have not even been updated. $50 billion is leaving the continent every year. It's increasing at 6.5%. Transfer pricing constitutes the majority of illicit financial flows. and it's about 75% of the total, and then criminal activities are part of it. And then, the conversation has remained pretty much the same. So I think we need to have clarity at a conceptual level on why exactly has this become such a massive, sexy, romantic thing that everyone is associating with, and what exactly does the conversation mean for us. And I think from our perspective, we think that it's important to be very clear that illicit financial flows is not like this new discovery that has come from Global Financial Integrity, a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and who said, look, this is the silver bullet. You solve it, you solve the global development challenges. I think for us, what makes the conversation relevant is simply the fact that we are talking about the ways in which wealth and resources from this continent are unconscionably taken out of the continent. We're talking about that net transfer of resources and wealth from the continent. That has been an issue since maybe the time that the modern global economy was invented. So really, this is an old problem. It's not like a new, and big discovery. And I think we think that at the root of illicit financial flows is the stranglehold of global capital and transnational capital, and particularly the stranglehold on economic production, on trade, on finance, and the control that that has on the ownership and distribution of the overall economic surplus from the continent, and how that is being deepened in this particular time. And we think that there are three very key phenomena that we need to be cognizant of that has made this intensification a big issue for our times. And the first one is the reimposition of the neoliberal paradigm on our continent. And this is something that is huge. In our think tanks, our movements should really be challenging. There now seems to be a consensus out there that there is no alternative for this before. But right now, if you look at the head of UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, which was progressive at some point, is someone who's coming from IFC, someone coming from what we used to call the Washington Consensus institutions. You go into UNECA, you cannot talk anymore about alternative economic thinking. It's now that the dominance of this neoliberal paradigm is taken and assumed to be the only way forward. You look at countries like Zimbabwe that are trying to come out of crisis. There is no debate at all. It's just assumed that improve your ease of doing business, create the best possible conditions to attract FDI, focus on your primary production, export your primary commodities and all of that. Like this debate right now is actually going largely unchallenged. The sad reality is that the alternative voices around this are way out on the periphery, and I think we have to admit that we've really thoroughly lost the ground to the extent that even the young generations that are coming up, they are breathing these ideas as the only ideas to think about the economy. So there's something that's massive that is happening there around this re-emergence and this reimposition of the neoliberal paradigm that just makes IFFs, a big issue. And you see it in wholesale privatization, liberalization of trade, liberalization of investment, liberalization of finance, and the resulting deindustrialization that we've seen. And again, the rollback on economic diversification and even complete deletion of the conversations that we used to have around linkages, around breaking the angular nature of our economies and all. And we are seeing again an accelerated expansion of transnational corporations and control. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at PowerPoint, so you might be left behind. You're seeing the expansion where if we are liberalizing, particularly with regards to services, social services, we are seeing the entry of transnational corporations into that sector as well in terms of providing basic services as our own economy is fragmenting. You can move on a little bit. So if you look at Glencore, which is the case that we were asked to speak about, this is an Anglo-Swiss multinational commodity and mining company that is headquartered in Switzerland. It's registered in Jersey. It's ranked among the top 10 largest companies on Fortune 500. Founded by an infamous guy called Mark Rich in 1974. It's a whole movie can be made about this guy called Mark Rich. He was a criminal in the US. He was convicted in absentia because he ran away of money laundering, corruption, dealing with despotic regimes and all of that. And he got pardoned by Bill Clinton. On Bill Clinton's last day in office, the last thing he did was to sign a pardon for this guy. Not that he had even gone through the court process, he was somewhere in Europe all that day, but he was pardoned. And this is the guy who founded Glencore. And it has continued with that kind of DNA. When we say it's a large company, sometimes we underestimate it. For 40 years, this was a private company, it was not listed, so people didn't actually know what this was. But we're talking of a company that is controlling 60% of the zinc market globally and 50% of the copper market globally. A company that has over 300,000 hectares of farmland, and this is just a tiny little bit. It has over 200 billion in annual revenues, and that's actually 10 times the GDP of Zambia, the country where they're operating. So when we start to talk about the power balance, we talk about it a lot, how these companies can afford the best lawyers, the best accountants, the best brokers, whatever it is. This company is 10 times larger than Zambia in terms of its size. In 2012, the BBC reported that Glencore had more ships than the British Navy. That's just how massive they've become. And none of these ships were declared on any asset registers. They were only revealed after some thorough investigations, and they said the statement that came from Glencore was that we were not talking about them for commercial reasons. And apparently that is actually an adequate explanation. And they have a history of dealing with rogue states, including the apartheid regime here in South Africa. There's a case that came out in the Paradise Papers in 2017 about their dealings in the Congo, enlisting an infamous Israeli billionaire to negotiate a deal there. He was given $45 million to negotiate a deal, and it's a loan that only becomes due if a deal fails to go through. And for him, for $45 million, he managed to get that deal signed. And there's others who've done research just on how Congo lost out in such a deal. They employ 20,000 people as a company in Zambia. And for 10 good years, since they went in 2000 and started production in 2001, they did not pay a single cent in corporate income tax. And there was this is thanks to the work of civil society, really. There was pressure on the Zambia Revenue Authority to commission an audit, and it was done by Grant Thornton, and never formally released, but it was leaked, and it demonstrated that the company was involved in aggressive tax planning. And again, someone mentioned about language earlier on, because we also use tax planning, but all we're simply saying is that these are very sophisticated ways that they are avoiding to pay taxes, and they're moving money outside the country, but it's given a very nice Christian name, tax planning. And you had, they mentioned inconsistencies in reported production volumes, inexplicable increases in their production cost. The issue of transfer pricing was raised because they were selling copper at an artificially low price to Glencore in Switzerland. So to their own company in Switzerland, and the sale will be brokered by a Glencore UK subsidiary. So if you then look at the financials, the subsidiary, this was a UK-based subsidiary, the subsidiary will also charge monies for brokering the sale of copper from Glencore in Zambia to Glencore in Switzerland. And at the end of the day, that's how you eat into your profit. And by the end of the day, you really have zero profits that can actually be taxed. And if you move a few slides there, you can see a typical financial, right there. That's a typical 2011 financials for Glencore. 101,000 tons of copper produced, 890 million in revenues, 77 million paid in taxes. But this is just your duties. But in terms of corporate income tax, 000. It actually been played. And it's not taken to be vulgar actually. For commercial reasons, you can be in a situation like that. Just move to the next slide, because this is just a lot has been discussed earlier. Just another one, I think one more. There's something happening with your thing. It's not showing photos even, because I was going to show you the corporate structure of Glencore, but if you this one here. the structure of Mopani copper mine. But basically, if you look at the structure of that Mopani copper mine, 90% is owned by a company called Kalisa Investments, which is registered in the British, and this is a top secret jurisdiction. And then that British Virgin Islands company is owned by Glencore Finance, which is registered in Bermuda. So you manipulate these different locations in different secret jurisdictions, and it enables yourself to pretty much work down your profits again to zero, maximize your expenses in the country where you're actually doing production, and shift all your wealth to these secret jurisdictions. And one interesting fact is that Glencore was renting a single room at Applebee's law firm in Bermuda, which is where Glencore Finance is situated, and they describe this as ensuring a robust physical footprint. So it's a single room, and that's where all the wealth is going. So I wish your thing was showing, because I wanted to show this. It's similar to some of what Khadija showed, just the web of subsidiaries and how they are located in different places. And some are for financing, some are for just owning the brand. So, you're doing production in Africa where there's never any profits to declare. And there's a reason why secret jurisdiction are such a big thing, and I think it has come up in some of our conversations in the morning. You have total banking secrets there, trust and foundations registers, you cannot find them. There's no recorded company ownership, even wealth ownership. Limited, there's very limited transparency around that. There's no public company ownership, and I'm just reading the Financial Secret Jurisdiction Index for the US. For Switzerland, which is where Glencore is headquartered, and this is the #1 on the Financial Secrets Index. There's no country-by-country reporting. There's no corporate tax disclosure. So just to wrap it up, we've talked about the impacts, wages. I really think for South Africa, we are leading with regards to putting wages at the center of this conversation. I think the research that was done by AIDC on non-min really opened everyone's eyes to say when companies engage in practices like this, at the end of the day, that's how they will refuse to pay living wages, because they'll be arguing that they're not making money, whereas we know that money is going up. But there's a question of social development, which I think is also well captured in the framing of this conference. Investment that is needed in health, investment that is needed in education, with this whole fees must fall movement here, and we are all wondering how we're going to be able to finance that. We can finance that if we can tell the losses that we are seeing here. But there's also key questions around economic growth and transformation. If you look at when Glencore exports from Zambia, they are exporting at a sixth of the prices of copper when Glencore in Switzerland then re-exports, to such an extent that if Zambia was getting the prices that Glencore in Switzerland is getting, they would increase, for one particular, they would have increased their GDP by more than $10 billion. So this affects, even how we're looking at economic growth and how we're looking at the question of economic transformation. But also this undermines our governance, because for companies to be able to do this, there's a lot of night visits to key people in key institutions of our state that should be ensuring that we have proper governance. Just to close, lastly, I think when we look at what we need to do, I really see this as a political issue. I don't think it's a lot to do with us scratching our heads at the technical level. It's about the political will that we have to tackle this, and we're going to need African unity and global solidarity to be able to tackle this, because these are issues that affect us beyond our particular national jurisdiction and even beyond the region. We're going to be needing to be speaking with one voice, but I think we need to elevate this aspect of, conceptually, really looking at this. It's a question of economic justice, and it's a question of, of which how the continent is being robbed and our individual countries are being robbed in ways that are decades old, and we've just found a new language to be expressing them. The technical ways of dealing with this are fully documented. They are there. If we get political will, I'm convinced that we'll be able to, to handle this. And political will comes from people power. That's the last thing that I'll say. It's only when we have pressure from below exerting itself at our institutions, that's the only way that those institutions start to become real and they can potentially deliver the results that we want. Thank you. Well, asante sana, those are the words that Mugabe uttered. I think he thought that they would deflect a coup in November. It means thank you in Swahili.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. My name is Michael. My colleagues have done about half of what I was supposed to do, so certainly I will take half of the time that I was supposed to spend. But there's a few background issues. My presentation focuses on tax evasion and tax avoidance, particularly the argument around the thin line between the two. But in terms of background, I think it is important for us to remember that if you look at the history of taxation, a few things to point out. One is that it's actually a contractual arrangement between the taxpayer and the state, so that citizens commit to do certain things and the state commit to do certain things also in return because of the taxes that they pay. So in essence, we want to look at taxation as granting the citizens not just the moral authority, but also the duty to demand accountability from the state. And secondly, closely linked to that, is that we also would want to look at taxation as a process that enables us to clearly understand state legitimacy, for that matter. So that if a state that is relatively dependent on taxes is also largely, it's argued, would likely be more accountable, to the citizens. And then thirdly, linked to that is the fact that we've had cases where, if you look at the whole arrangement between individuals as taxpayers and corporates as taxpayers, the individual tends to have far less advantage in terms of the leeway to negotiate with the state. Unlike corporates, that to a large extent have not only the financial power and muscle to negotiate with the state, but in some cases even hold the state hostage in terms of what they pay and what they don't pay. So you have a situation where a citizen is generally extremely vulnerable in terms of, if you look at the relationship between the individual taxpayer and the corporate taxpayer. Now, these are just general broad things that I think we have also highlighted in the previous presentation. But from the background, we want to look at tax evasion and tax avoidance from the basic perspective that tax evasion is illegal, tax avoidance is generally legal. I'm using the word generally because corporations tend to use tax avoidance as a means of reducing their tax obligations. But if you look at the nexus of the arrangements around tax avoidance, in certain cases where you have weak legal and policy framework that enables tax avoidance, in most cases you realize that it's the corporations that manipulate the state to ensure that the laws and the policies remain weak so that they don't pay tax. So while we may argue that it is generally acceptable, like Britt was talking about earlier, that tax planning is generally acceptable. In essence, we want to look at it from a much broader perspective, that it is generally immoral also, the kind of argument that Asha was talking about in the morning. And both of them, tax avoidance and tax evasion, eventually lead to loss of revenue for the state. So if the state has to provide the services, then it becomes difficult for the state to do so, because whichever way you look at it, tax evasion or tax avoidance, it reduces the state's capacity to collect revenue and also to have access to that revenue for purposes of provision. Now, I will give us a Kenyan case about a flower farm, but I want to look at it from two perspectives. First, that it was a classic case of the example between the thin line between tax evasion and tax avoidance. And two, that state agencies, in this case the Revenue Authority in Kenya, in some cases have sufficient authority and power to be able to deal with multinational corporations. But I think the argument here is that we also do not want to look at the African state as inherently desperate, that there is nothing we can do to be able to retain our resources, particularly our taxes, within our jurisdictions. So if you look at the Karuturi Flowers case, Karuturi Flowers is one of the biggest flower farms or flower multinational corporations in Kenya. Strangely, as it is now, it is under receivership. And the process, the receivership of this corporation has to do with a lot of the things that the Revenue Authority was looking at. Now, the unique thing again also is that it has a subsidiary in Ethiopia. So when Karuturi Flowers had tax problems with the Kenya Revenue Authority, their initial threat was, if you don't allow us to invest in your economy, then we are moving to the next, which is Ethiopia. And I think the argument should be that if you want to look at illicit financial flows, particularly from a tax perspective, then we cannot look at it from a country perspective only, a single country perspective for that matter. We must look at it collectively, so that if you want to seal the leakages, then the multinational corporation will eventually have nowhere else to run to. So in this case, they had a sufficient reason, to move to a different jurisdiction. Now, the size of the corporation is so much so that most of the flowers that you will find in Europe, at least, estimates have clearly indicated, at least 1 in every 10 or 1 in every 9 of sticks of flowers that you find sold in Europe are actually produced by Karuturi flowers. That is how big it is, just to try and give you a picture of how important it is. However, this corporation, which has a subsidiary in Dubai, I don't want to call it a subsidiary. Actually, it is generally a registered warehouse in Dubai. Now, this corporation uses Dubai as a conduit for shifting profits from the Kenyan economy, to Europe, and I will explain that in a short while. And the other challenge with it is that it is not just a question of shifting profits. It's not a question of losing tax revenue. It is also a question of the price of labor. And my colleague from PSI was talking about this in the morning. Karuturi Flowers is also one of the corporations that was paying the least amount of wages within the flower production belt in Kenya. Those of you who have been to Kenya, I'm sure you know where Naivasha is. And the wages range from $65 to maximum $100 every month. That is not a livable wage. It's actually not anywhere near minimum wage that one would, talk about being able to sustain their livelihood. Now, in this particular case, there was a dispute between the corporation and the Kenyan authority, and the dispute was up to $11 million US, which the Kenya Revenue Authority was claiming from the corporation. The argument initially was that Karuturi Flowers did not commit any offense in terms of, declaring losses in Kenya by moving their profits to other jurisdictions. And the legal argument then, and that's where the thin line between tax avoidance and tax evasion becomes important, the legal argument was that the law and the policy framework allowed them to do whatever they were doing at that time. Now, the Revenue Authority moved forward and tracked the transactions from Kenya to Dubai and eventually to Europe, and mainly in the Netherlands. And they noticed a very huge disparity, that in Kenya they were declaring the price of one stem of flowers at $0.04 US. Very small amount. In Kenya shillings is about 4 shillings or something like that. But the same stem was sold in Europe at about $7.8. And what KRA was worried about is what causes this, significant increase in price of the same cut flower that is sold in Kenya at a much less price. Then they realized that the invoices that were submitted at the point of export in Kenya were not submitted for direct export to Europe. They were submitted for transit to Dubai, and then later on exported from Dubai to Europe. But we all know that, and that's why I was giving the specific locations where the company operates. We all know that there are no flowers that Kalkuri flowers producers in Dubai. All their flowers come from Kenya. And therefore, if they were exporting flowers, they should have exported the same from Kenya. You know, again, one would claim that there were logistical challenges between these two jurisdictions. I mean, Kenya has direct both shipment by air and by sea to Europe. So if that wasn't the intention, then they should have just exported the flowers directly. Now, the link in this case is that if you look at the amount of money that for about 3 years, the amount of profits that they were declaring for those 3 years under dispute was either very little or nothing at all. And eventually, when they were closing down, their claim was they are not making any profits in Kenya. But they were making a lot of profits in Europe, you know, where we know the flowers are not produced. So if the broad argument here is that, one, it is possible to be able to track how African countries lose resources. And two, it is possible to be able to deal with this particular problem. You know, if there is a commitment to deal with it. And it is not just a technical problem, it is not just an institutional problem, it is more importantly a political problem. And dealing with that political will to be able to retain the resources within our jurisdictions, I think is the most important aspect of it. Just a few things to point out. Some of these are figures that we already know, so I'll just skip them. But a few things to point out here. First is that over and above policy and legal transformation, to be able to retain our resources within our continent, we also need to look at two things, which for me are very important. African countries lose revenue. They don't lose it to nowhere, they lose it to somewhere. So as much as we are looking at our internal economies, we also need to focus more importantly on how multinational corporations are using other jurisdictions and look at the source of the revenue and the destination of the revenue. So tackling illicit financial flows is a question of the source versus where the money eventually ends up. And I think that's an important thing that we need to look at. And then, of course, the bigger debate on changing the global rules. I conclude this by this particular quote from Joseph Stiglitz. We know that the global rules are written by multinational corporations in their favor. And the antidote for dealing with this, as Briggs Bomber was mentioning earlier, is that the citizens, all of us, the people need to demand that these rules are done in a manner that will favor us as taxpayers. Asante sana.
So, independent from governments. You can go to this point, the second slide. If you go to this, this one. I showed this yesterday also. This is a picture. So you have this good journalist, a lot of good journalists at Daily Maverick. But it also shows how hard it is, despite the discussion of the 10, 15 years, to really make the issue of illicit financial flows or how the transnational corporations are really working. How difficult it is to make it sink into even sort of good journalism. So Marianne Tam, I sent Marianne Tam this picture because she had been complaining like 2-3 articles about, she was wondering whether this outfit there, Cash Master Services, the green one there, if they would be able to pay back a debt they had of 386 million rand or something, which they illegally or fraudulently have been sort of charged and get paid by SASA. And I sent an email to her and I explained that the question was even kind of like wrongly put in a way. It was very difficult. So, I mean, this cash payment services, there was another audit of this, special audit who had access to the books of this company. And when they had this 5-year illegal contract with the social grant distributor Sasa in South Africa. And this audit shows, among other things, that they had paid a royalty of about 1.2 billion rand to another outfit in this organogram in royalties for kind of using the technology or using the name Cash Pay Master for whatever. And probably it was paid to some other of these. You can't see here really because it's too blurry, but some of these green and blue outfits are in Mauritius, different these type of islands, and that is usually the place to which you are paying these royalties and so on. So to ask whether that outfit there, which is one of 22 in South Africa, and so one of 64 in the whole world, if they can afford to pay $386 million, it's kind of like, then you haven't understood what Net 1 is, like the nature of this beast. So this is just one example. Secondly, now we can go to the next. This was the first example that made us aware of AIDC of this problem. That was when 1,300 workers at this mine, owned in different steps by a Canadian mining company, threatened to retrench 1,300 workers. And when the management, which is very unusual, when they produced the financial statements of this outfit here, this mine, which basically is the only productive value producing unit in this whole organogram. Well, then you could see from the financial statement that they have, it was bought by the Canadian company in 2004, 2005, and this mine, according to the financials, hardly ever made any profit. And the reason was a loan from this outfit here, the gray outfit on Barbados. So this mine was paying back an interest on this loan. It was 2.3 billion or something like that. 2 to 300 million per year in interest charges instead of paying dividends, which would be taxed. So this is an example. You heard the expression thin capitalization. So this is an example of thin capitalization. Then we can go to next. This is long in there. I've spoken about this example many times, so I couldn't repeat. I shall just stress one detail now. This is something I sort of really became aware of when I came to South Africa 8 years ago. I was kind of very innocent before I came here. But that is kind of like how the capitalist system is, how criminal it is. How criminal. It's kind of like it's the foundation of the system is a lot of illegal activities. They are breaking their own laws, which they ask the working class and ordinary people to follow. And by the way, if there's any liberal in the audience like that, there's also the United Nations report just coming out saying that the capitalist system has to be abolished if humankind shall survive. So you can just read that report. United Nations. Anyway, in this case, as many of you know, the issue here mainly was the issue of paying a sales commission from the main mine in South Africa, Western Platinum, to outfit Western Metal Sales from Bermuda, which had the same address as Apple Services, a law firm. And the issue came up as a research question in the Marikana Commission, if it would have been possible at all for Longmin to start to negotiate with the striking operators. And you know that they didn't want to do that, instead they were shocked. There's a thick, I think the report is lying on the tables outside and so on. I never dared to say that in the report, and it was not even clear to me then, but I can say now that I think that this is the case in many cases. This payment of 245 million rand to Bermuda, it was not something that benefited shareholders in UK or pension funds. I'm now convinced that was only benefiting a small cabal of insiders who had the bank card or they had the access to the bank account of Bermuda. And the reason why one can say that is that when one compare the financials of these two companies, the costs and the revenues of these two companies with the public accounts of Longin, then one can see that this payment to Bermuda was registered by the auditors, which by the way is KPMG as usual. It was registered as a payment to an outside company instead of to a subsidiary of Longin. Okay, and that's why I firmly believe that this was only benefiting some 3, 5, 7 people. And I think that is a very often the case also in different of these kind of tax planning actions, which really not is a tax planning thing. It's almost like in order to bring the trade unions on board, as Briggs Bomba pointed out, we have really started, we will, whether we are correct or not, you can change this to the next. You can change to the next. You can change it to the next. We have really started to almost, at least when we are agitating, to treat the tax evasion part of this as a side effect of a general profit shifting. Of course, it means that the tax revenue services, the taxman in the different countries are losing tax revenue, but mostly it is the workers and ordinary people who are losing money which otherwise would lie on the wage bargaining table. But now you can't negotiate for it any longer because it's moved away. And I think that this sort of primary school mathematics fact, which is illustrated here, and Dominic spoke about it in the introduction, that in order to save 28 million rand in tax expenses at the tax rate of 88%, you have to move 100 million rand out of the country. This, the reason why we haven't seen this, and why the discourse around profit shifting has been only become a thing about tax evasion. I think it is because in the mainstream economic science, if you like, which I don't really think is a science, it's more like a handicraft, it's more like a craftsmanship. Isn't it true? It's not a science. I mean, brain surgery, that is a science, but not economics. The reason why we don't see this, and it takes kind of, it is because wages has such a low status in economic science. Wages are the problem, isn't it? Workers are the problem. And wages are bad for the economy. Profits are good for the economy. And that is kind of like an ideological closure which stops people from seeing this basic fact. And when OECD, for example, have their campaign against base erosion and profit shifting, and they speak about that totally in the whole world, some between $100 billion, no, 100 billion, 100 billion US, was it 100 trillion?
100 to 240.
Yeah, 100 to 240. This is this report from, it's kind of like a, then they speak about the tax revenue lost to the services kind of. But I mean, if you take it at the, if you take the average kind of like effective tax rate of this, of 22% or 20%, then some of you know that the mathematical operation is to divide this 100 or 240 by 0.22 or something like that. And then suddenly the mass of money that is moved from a country to these, what you are called conduits, or is over 1 trillion US dollars, or presently in South Africa, 15 trillion South African rand, if we were able to sort of change it into rand. So that is important. Person. Then I can just say, welcome to Deputy Commander-in-Chief Floyd here. We have a kind of a long-standing project with the economic freedom fighters to make kind of general tax avoidance act, because there is a chapter in the Tax Income Act in South Africa which basically, and here I can challenge a little what you said about tax avoidance is the legal thing, but tax evasion is illegal. I mean, tax avoidance is also illegal, because the law says that you can't only do a transaction or a business deal only for the purpose of lowering your tax. That's illegal. That's tax avoidance is illegal. The problem is that there's no court case whatsoever brought to the South African court which is ever kind of convicting anyone for illegal tax avoidance or for tax avoidance. You have to have some other purpose by doing a transaction other than just to reducing your tax bill. Okay, that's what we said. And that's why we have a discussion about having a special act with the Congress from the EFF. I can say there also that this is about political will, and I will finish with this. I mean, it's not a rocket science to come to grips with this. All mining companies are using these sales commissions. A small minority. They are paying sales commission of 2%, 7%, 9% to Malta, Dubai, Barbados, Cayman Islands, etc. You can just have a law saying, no, you can't sell South African minerals sitting outside South Africa. It's illegal, it's forbidden. You can't do that. Full stop. It would create chaos, I tell you, among the auditing firms and many of the mining companies. So why isn't that done? Why isn't that done? Fortunately, hopefully, we have political representatives in the South African Parliament. I hope, I still believe we should put such proposals to the Parliament and challenge sort of the complicity of the Parliament in all these practices, which is making South Africa much poorer, and the majority poor, and the small minority stinking rich.
I don't know about the rest of you, but that was a hell of a lot of information, but all of it extremely useful, I think. And I'm sure if we gave the speakers an hour each, they would have been able to unpack all of these things over that hour with still more information missing, because that's the way these TNCs operate. So if you feel a bit overwhelmed by the information, don't be. This is the tricks that they have. The scribing that Khadija was talking about. It tries to mystify these issues. And this is what we try to unveil. So we are running a bit behind in time, already by 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 hands to make a comment, to make a question, and then I'm going to allow each speaker 30 seconds to 1 minute to respond. After that, we'll have a 5-minute break and come in for the final session before the cheese and wine. Is that agreeable with comrades? 4 and 2. Amanda. 3 hands. I recognize Mom, Dr. Mom. Wait, I'll take 4. Mom, Waile, Sunita, and Prakash in that order. Please keep it brief.
Khadija, thank you so much, and I appreciate that you don't have respect for language. Sometimes bullshit is just bullshit. There's no other way to explain it. While you have elaborated what happened in the Zuma regime, with due respect, I don't say this disrespectfully, yes, standard 5. I'm interested in knowing how IFFs and tax injustice went on under the watch of a master's in economics. Because that same master's in economics is today championing the fight against IFFs and for tax justice. So it would be interesting for me to see what he did in his term and how this happened during his 2 terms in office. But also, I don't know what your terms of reference are. I would really like you to deal with the silent killer that we never talk about in these gatherings, which is the interstate dispute settlement court, which is what really has held the South African economy in terms of black empowerment unmoving. Like in 2007, we were taken to court already over the mining charter by a company called the Fellini Brothers. We wanted 26% beneficiation. Cut a long story short, we settled for 5%. And an article was released on the 31st of August by Mail and Guardian that says, since 2015 to date, black business ownership has decreased from 33.5 to 27.8%. So clearly, this system of impoverishment, the 2 economies you talked about, is not getting better. It's not just the IFFs, it's the other silent international racism in these courts that will drag us to each time we try to beneficiate locally. Thank you.
Thank you. Comrade Wayile?
Two questions. One relates to the ability of multinational institutions to beat one country against each other. Because it happens with trade unions, and it happens with different governments, because when they engage on the basis of attracting foreign direct investment for their own countries. Then the question is that how do we navigate in terms of that particular space, because there are competing interests. Because I'm raising this issue that on the basis that all these institutional governments, they always reflect on the crisis, but there's no ability to address the situation. The last issue relates to, are there any case studies, success stories, which we can begin to use, even if at a minimal scale? But that is linked with the ability of the movement, whatever alternative movement, in terms of subordinating narrow and petty differences in the context of children, this noble cause.
Thank you. Just a few pointers. The BEE deals were also very disadvantageous. One of the problems with the BEE deals was the fact that it was heavily geared in the sense that there were a lot of loans. I remember taxpayers that paid in excess of 500 million into the FISC every year in the form of corporate income tax that for the following 10 years never contributed a cent. So these deals were set up in a way that the former owners benefited, but loaded the companies with so much debt. And we're sitting with a lot of those deals in this country that is draining the tax base and revenue base. In terms of the mining companies and the case studies, I think it's important to note that there's a particular modus operandi. The way the scheme is set up, firstly it's set up by the Prince-Run Mafia, which is the firms. Look at the articles by Prem Sticker, look at the US documents and the UK parliamentary documents. These schemes are set up by the tax firms. They are sold by the tax firms. No multinational corporation can manage these schemes because there are so many entities involved. And especially in the mining sector, marketing hubs were set up. That is the approach and the scheme. The Australian Parliamentary Committee actually did studies and confronted a lot of the mining companies. They've now come out subsequently with guidelines about how to improve their compliance. I think it's important that we learn something. We don't have to revisit this issue because the way the scheme is set up is pretty much the same. From the royalties perspective, I'm not sure if you are aware. South Africa pays a lot in royalties. But what you may not be aware of is the fact that around 94, South Africa lost a lot of key valuable assets, intellectual property, things that we associate with South Africa. Look at them around you. Most of them are not here. They were moved offshore at a very low or no price. And today we are paying for the use of that intellectual property. The way multinationals are set up, one entity will house all the IP and charge all the other entities again, another way to pull profits offshore. Always competing with Mauritius for investment, but we're always falling short because we can't compete on that level, but also our transportation costs, etc., are too much. But they offer a lot of favorable terms. But one of the problems with Mauritius is you've got, again, set up by the Prince-Run Mafia, you've got post box companies. So companies that have no substance, they only have a post box address managed by an auditing firm or an accounting firm, tax firm. And this is where part of the problem is because we have all these entities, difficult to trace them. Recently in South Africa, one of the biggest problems we faced when I was at SARS was getting information from an offshore entity
maybe it's a question for Dick specifically. You know, Dick has shifted the focus to looking at the impact on wages. But I also think there should be, I mean, it is somewhat related, but looking at what is going to be the impact on the nature of production. And that doesn't just affect South Africa, but Africa as a whole in terms of the resource freedom. And again, it comes down to job creation or some economic effects in terms of, if you employ people locally, that's just, taxes and in that respect. So the way, there's, I can't imagine, there's some way to quantify it, but it might be useful for us to do a case study. Maybe look at one commodity, one product, to illustrate what happens. To use an example, there's a lot of controversy, for example, with Starbucks in the UK. You cannot find, where is coffee produced? And you'll find that the nature of production of coffee, all the countries that produce it where you grow it actually comes from developing countries. But the so-called value add, where the real profits are generated, happens in your big countries like Germany, Japan, and France. So I think, I just wonder if there's a way for us to cost that impact. It might be useful as well.
So I know I'm giving the presenters a tough ask to respond in 1 minute, but your notification will take a minute and a half. So we can start with Khadija and go in the same way in which we started. And if the question wasn't directly posed, you may make some small closing remarks.
Thank you. So just very quickly on intangible assets, we didn't get to that, but for example, during the apartheid regime, Coca-Cola shifted their base to Swaziland. So although most people don't know this, Swaziland relies on Coca-Cola for income, and they charge Coke a 6% tax rate.
Yes.
Now, Coke manages to keep 33 billion routed through the Cayman Islands by paying itself for use of its own intangible assets, including the Coke brand. And the International Accounting Standards Board, as she mentioned, says that if a company owns the brand, there is no need for value to be externally determined, it's internally imputed until it's capitalized and sold. So that's how most companies that are publicly listed are trading bullshit, the idea of what they claim the brand is worth. But if it was actually sold, it would be sold at much less, just the real value. So she raises a very important point about how SAP Miller shifted its advertiser and other brands to the Netherlands, where as long as you own 100% of the subsidiary, you can artificially inflate costs. I think with regards to Mauritius, we're not really competing with Mauritius for foreign direct investment. Double taxation treaty means that everybody goes through Mauritius before it comes to other countries. So it's not really a competitor, it's more like a veil of what's really happening. Because South Africa has the resources, but they want to depreciate the capital or move the capital through under-invoicing and so forth through Mauritius, which is a tax haven and a dirty shit country, but called by Transparency International one of the cleanest countries in the world, because Transparency International is the one I think have done this. Just moving on to the comrade's question, which is very important. The Guptas were able to do what they did because systemically our political economy was ripe for this kind of exploitation. We have a description of beneficial owners, but no legislation making sure that it's important to have it as accountable. So a bank only needs to find out certain information like the director. There's no requirement for a beneficial owner to disclose themselves. And when they do, it's self-regulated. I can put my neighbor's gardener's name and give him $100 to borrow his ID. Who's going to check? So we need to have beneficial ownership legislation backing up what we claim we want to find out. In the same way, country by country reporting, putting a tax on flows to jurisdictions where no real economic activity occurs. Very, very simple legislation that requires political will could save us $500 billion in money that belongs to citizens and or is generated with use of our infrastructure. Tax is not only to generate money, but it's to correct problems in the economy. If a tax is put on illicit financial flows, criminal activity would be corrected because it would be scrutinized. So we just need to make sure that the right laws are in place, the right diagnosis in place in order for the correct solution to come about. So while the Guptas are a problem, the system itself is vulnerable with many escape routes. And as long as we shore up the legislation, beneficial ownership registry, a minerals exchange, disclosure of mining contracts, valuation of intangible assets, as she mentioned, then we start capturing and catching what's really happening, and everything is solved. All the government needs to do, or tomorrow morning, scribble it, sign it, and go out for that copy.
Amandla.
Wait.
Amandla.
Wait.
Yeah, I'll just respond to the question about how we can coordinate across countries. I think it's actually, without that, there's no solution. The example of Zambia that I was giving just before the last election, not this particular election, the Zambian government had decided to take on Glencore because there was so much pressure. There was an audit report, they had all the evidence. So they increased corporate income tax, they introduced the profit marked taxation for Glencore, and there was a massive uproar, not just from Glencore. The IMF stepped in and talked about the competitiveness of the Zambian economy. The World Bank stepped in, and there was this massive global alliance that supported the position of Glencore. But not only that, Glencore threatened to shut down several mines in Zambia. And you have to understand now that we say this is a company that's making $200 billion per year. So they are 10 times bigger than the economy of Zambia. And they can afford, even if they know that we do need the mining operation, they can actually afford to wait it out. The same way companies can afford to enter a market by dumping their goods, making a loss if they need to for 3 years, so that you eliminate competition. They can afford to play those games against countries. And the funny thing is that Zambia did not get help from anyone. They were on their own. Until when Lungu came in, the first thing he did after he got re-elected was to reverse the measures that they put on table. So without the kind of regional solidarity that will make sure that our countries are speaking with one voice, and we deal with this issue of companies playing one country against the other, or even sometimes engaging in this race to the bottom, we will actually look at, okay, how much is Zambia charging now in terms of corporate income tax, then we go lower so that we become more competitive than Zambia. Without us attending to that, there's actually no hope to this. And that's why ultimately I say it's a political issue, because being able to coordinate and build such kind of regional solidarity and Pan-African solidarity requires political leadership, much more than it does technical devices. Well, the last thing I'll say is when you talk of experts, because there are a lot of recommendations that are coming out, especially those who will be looking at the OECD processes, there's always this conversation about you must be able to hire and retain experts, and people that are mentioned are lawyers and accountants. I think we need to make sure that our institutions have political economists. There should be political economists and SARS, rather than just focusing on lawyers and accountants, people who will be able to understand these issues and unpack them from the conceptual terrain that we've been discussing today. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just one comment to make. Tackling illicit financial flow is not a national problem. It's a continental and a global issue. So we have to look at it from that perspective. And I think in the African continent, we will say that the continent has made some steps. In 2015, the AU signed on to the Making Report, which largely talks about illicit financial flows. I think the next step is how we commit our countries to implement the recommendations of the Making Commission.
It's about would it change the nature of the economy, or would it sort of not only produce profit, for example, but diversify the economy? I haven't thought about it so much. So what I can think about is research and development. So if you retain your investments in the country, if you are not siphoning off the money abroad, you will have a sort of, some of it will go much more to wages, it will also be taxed, but you will also retain the profits in the country. What should you do with this money? Well, some of the successful corporations or enterprises, whether they are state or private, they spend a lot of money on research and development. Even research that at the end of the day perhaps shown just to be futile or didn't lead anywhere, but you have sort of you employ an army of researchers and technology just sitting and thinking, developing And that is the way you are developing the economy. As for the government, when you invest in health, in water, in sanitation, you will eventually, in the long term, you will raise the whole the whole level of the population and the educational level of the population and so on. And that will transform the economy. So it's obvious that if you send out most of the resources to another country, then it will just be your hand-to-mouth economy. As for coffee, Sweden is a very silly example because we're the second most coffee drinking country in the world. The most coffee drinking country in the world is Finland, my mother comes from Finland. Of course, you can't grow any coffee in Sweden. You can't hardly grow beetroot.
Thank you very much to all the comrades. I'm going to implore you to take 5 minutes. Have discipline so that we can start at 3:04. Thank you. Have a quick cup of tea. Didn't finish your cup back inside.
I'll show you what's up.
Yeah, but we what? No, I'll tell you what. You comment. About what? No,
Okay,
wait a minute.
I don't want to
I must actually be precise with everything so that they must see the compliance. Yeah. No. We look at you still remember those words like you can't remember it's no longer there. Those workers that have been every month there's a company that remember I told you about it. Yeah. So the approach 61 now I was also doing it was doing section 1988. But they said to me the electronic consultant